Well, good morning, everyone. If we haven't met before, my name is Zach, as Mark mentioned. I'm the creative arts director here at 938 Church. So typically, you'll have seen me up here on stage playing an instrument, getting to be with our worship team. And if you've been here for the past few weeks, you may have noticed there's a few people who will get up here and speak. Mark, obviously, is the primary pastor who speaks most of the time, but then you'll also get to hear from Rachel and Lou and occasionally me. Now, if you've been here recently, you may have noticed there's a secret requirement for people not named Mark when they get up here on stage. If you're Rachel or Lou, and now Zach, I've come to learn, if you're going to be an official speaker up here, you have to show a picture of your dog. So I would like to show you all, if we have it, I think a picture of my dog Benji. He is 4 years old. He's a hound lab mix. He's super sweet. I love him very much. And that's it. I'm not going to connect it to my message. It's not a part of a point, but I have now met the requirement to be an official speaker. I'm co-equals with Rachel. So you have to treat me like I'm a real speaker here. All right, so this morning we're going to talk about worship, and we're going to do so through the lens of Psalm 100. The way the morning's going to work, it's going to be a little bit different. What I want to do is we're going to read the psalm, and then I'm going to try to convince you of something. After I try to convince you of something, we're going to then return to the psalm and see what it has to teach us about worship. So you can stay seated. I'm going to read Psalm 100. You can read it along on the screens, and just pay attention and see what comes to mind as you hear and read Psalm 100. Shout for joy to the Lord, all the earth. Worship the Lord with gladness. Come before him with joyful songs. Know that the Lord is God. It is he who made us, and we are his. We are his people, the sheep of his pasture. Enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. Give thanks to him and praise his name. For the Lord is good, and his love endures forever. His faithfulness continues through all generations. So like I said, I want to convince you of something this morning. To begin, I want to start by asking you two specific questions. Don't say the answers out loud, but think about what's the first or second thing that initially comes to mind. So first question, what do you worship? And two, what do you love? What do you worship and what do you love? I want to convince you this morning that you and me and everyone you know, if you are a human being, you are a worshiper. It doesn't matter if you're a believer in a religion, if you're an atheist, an agnostic, an American, where you come from, where you live, your family structure, none of that matters. If you meet the requirement of being a human being who lives on this earth, you are a worshiper. And it's something that you can't not do. You wake up and you do it from the moment you wake to the moment you go to sleep, and you might even do it in your dreams. You are, by definition, a worshiper. Now, what I don't mean by this at first is the typical Christian sense you may have heard that phrase said. You may have heard something like, because you were created by God, you therefore are meant to worship him. That is true, but I mean in even more simple, fundamental sense. Because you're a human being, you worship, and you can't not do it. Now, how do I know this? On one hand, it's a simple fact. It's because you love and desire and want, and you have needs, and you lack, and you can get hurt, and you can express anger and hold grudges. All of these things, we would say, form who we are. They form our identity. We like to think we're rational beings, but we are actually primarily emotional beings. We are formed by the things we love and want and desire and what we think we lack and how we compare ourselves to each other. These things form your identity, and it's how you typically form your self-worth. It's how you see yourself. If you think about it for a moment, you know this is what marketers have figured out. They know that if they can tap into your desire and what you love and what you want to become and what you don't have because the person you want to be like has, if they can tap into this fact, they don't have to make you a worshiper. You already will be one. They've already got you. You may, and I may like to think that we rationally click buy now or subscribe or follow. But really, something's happening at a deeper level where we are saying, yes, I want that. Yes, I do love that. Yes, I've been desiring that. I want to be like that person. I want to be like that brand or that influencer. We are driven by our emotional needs. So I said up front, I want to convince you that you're a worshiper. And how do I know you're a worshiper? It's this: you are emotionally influenced. Or if I wanted to put that in classic Christian language, I would say you are constantly being formed into a particular type of person. You live every waking moment of your life being emotionally influenced by something, someone, some idea, or some ideal. You are primarily influenced before you're persuaded. Before you have your beliefs, you've been influenced to have them. And most of us know this, but we tend to think that it's the other way around. We've been told that we are rational creatures, we are intelligent, and we are wise, and that we go about our lives day to day making decisions about who we're going to become and who we want to be and what we like and what we don't like and who's going to be our friends and what philosophy we're going to subscribe to. And we tell ourselves that we are rationally making those decisions because I think it's best for me. But in reality, if you're honest with yourself, and if I'm honest with myself, it's a little bit more like you've been influenced to like the things you like and be the person that you're becoming. And the hard part about it is that a lot of times it's happening at this subconscious fundamental level, and you can't not do it. We've been told that emotions are dangerous, or at least they can be, and that rationality is maybe more important. If you could just be someone who thinks, someone who makes good decisions, things will be better. If you would stop being so emotional, if you would stop being so emotionally attached to things, your life might improve. And we've been told that for some reason, these emotional attachments, the fact that we love and desire and need and have lack, these are like bugs in the system that we need to eradicate, and then we'll get better. But I want to submit to you that we're functioning the way we're supposed to function. Simply by being a human being, by being a creature that's created by God, you love, you desire, you want, you have lack, and you have need, and you can be hurt. It's not a bug in the system, it's what it means to be human. This is why a lot of times in Scripture, in many different ways, you see the phrase, guard your heart. You're meant to guard your heart because your heart is susceptible. You are constantly looking for things to love, looking for things to give your heart over to. And so you need to guard it because there are people and ideas and institutions and marketers and everything in our world is vying for your heart in some unique way. Now, here's the hard part. Every day you're worshiping, and if you're worshiping, you're being formed in a certain way. Another way to say that is that your identity is forming. And if anything I've said so far is even somewhat true, in that you're not fully in control of that, but you're being emotionally tugged in different ways, this means that your identity is not as much in your control as in the control of the things that you love and desire and want and need in life. Your identity is being formed in the image of what you love and who you want to be like. Think about your political party of choice, or your favorite sports team, or your favorite cultural institution. We like to tell ourselves that I rationally chose to be this political affiliation. I rationally chose to follow this sports team. I rationally chose to do this because I wanted to do it. But really, we've all kind of been influenced either this way or that way, or whichever way we've gone. Your identity is a little bit more the identity of the thing you love and less your own doing. Now, what I want to submit to you this morning is that everything I'm saying could simply be called worship. You're all worshiping every day. You're being influenced by things. You're being formed by the things that you love and desire. And that, on one hand, is simply called worship. Now, we've kind of forgotten this for the last, let's say, 30 to 40 years. But worship is really just a way of life. Another way to talk about worship would say that worship is the shape your life takes. Worship is who you're becoming as a human being. Let me do this. Let me ask you a question. Let's do a quick word association game. So far, I've said the word worship, let's say 10 times. Let's say I come to you and I say, hey, what's the first thing you think of when I say the word worship? Now, the data and historical evidence from Christians over the past 30 to 40 years would say that you thought of one of four things or associations about worship. You thought of either a specific time, a specific place, a specific set of people, or a specific action. Now, some of you may be able to guess what those four things might be. For most of us, it's something like Sunday mornings at church with other Christians singing worship songs. We've come to view worship as something that we do, an action that we do at a particular time and place with people that's like us. Now, what I'm not going to argue this morning is that that's wrong, because we should be coming together as Christians, worshiping God every week. But what I want to try to convince you of is that we've turned what should be a way of life into something we schedule on our calendars. We've turned a way of living, a way of shaping our lives, into something that we do for a moment when we pause our life. We live our life Monday through Saturday, we pause it, we come to church, we do a few things, and then we continue with our life. Worship isn't primarily just the fact that we come together and sing. Worship is the shape your life takes through the things that you love. I asked you up front the two questions of what do you worship and what do you love? Another way of asking those two questions would simply be to ask you, who are you? If I could put on special goggles and look deep into your souls and be able to somehow see, okay, that's what you worship and that's what you love, I would be able to tell you who you are fundamentally, and you could do the same to me. About 10 years ago, an author that I really like, his name is Jamie Smith, he teaches at Calvin College, he wrote a short book that was called You Are What You Love. And his premise was simply this point, that we aren't primarily rational creatures, we are primarily emotional creatures, and that the things that we love are the things that we worship. He said it like this: you worship what you love, and what you love forms you into a certain type of person, and it forms your identity. His point is something I'm drawing on this morning. Worship is a way of life, and you are already doing it. Worship isn't something that you have to learn to do. It isn't something that you walk in these doors and I say, okay, worship is X, Y, and Z, and you do these four things, and therefore you're worshiping. You're already doing it every second of every day, and it's simply the shape that your life is taking in the person that you're becoming. Have any of you heard of or been to a liturgy? Is the word liturgy familiar to you? For most of us, a liturgy is typically associated with a specific type of Christian worship, usually more historical forms of Christianity. So many of us might think of Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy, or even some Protestant churches like Anglicanism. And we tend to think about it as in terms of it's structured, it's dry, it's doing these 7 things in this order. But actually, liturgy has a much more simple meaning. And you can see it up here on the screen. The basic definition of a liturgy is this: a set of practices or habits performed by a group with the purpose of giving shape to a way of life. A liturgy is simply something that we participate in. It's practices and habits that we instill in our lives, and we perform it with others with the purpose of giving shape to our way of life. Now, think about that in terms of your favorite sports team or your favorite political party or your family dynamics. And you might begin to see that we all practice some liturgy somewhere, somehow. We have habits and practices that we do because we want to be like that person, or we want to be like that brand, or We want to become this type of person who accomplishes these things. We have certain habits that are forming something in us to be a certain type of person. Let me see if I can give you an example. So if you don't know me, I was born and raised in Michigan. I am a Midwesterner to the core. And my dad went to the University of Michigan. He went to undergrad and grad school there. So I can't confirm this story, but I imagine that when I was born, the doctors were ready to catch me, and they had a Michigan football onesie. And so when I popped out, they put it right on me. So within my first 6 seconds of life, I already was a Michigan fan. I don't remember a time when I wasn't a fan of Michigan football, and it's been ingrained in me since I was a little kid. Now, it's not hard. It probably won't be hard for me to convince you that if you are a football fan or just a sports fan in general, that there's a little bit of a religious tone to being a sports fan. And we can get a little bit cult-like with our sports teams. If you're not familiar with Michigan football, and I want to say if you're a Penn State fan, just bear with me. You got 5 minutes. I know this is going to make you sick, what you see on the screen. Just hold on. So if you don't know much about Michigan football, there is a holy calendar, just like every football team has their holy calendar. And first, you have to make it through the dark ages of January to September 1st, where there's no football. So you slog your way through these depressing months. You get to September 1st, and you feast because football has returned and your team is back. And we're going to win it this year. And so you have your holy calendar, which is the full season, but then you have holy days. And you know your football team has specific holy days. So for Michigan, we have 3 very specific holy days. The first one is anytime we play Notre Dame. It's a historic matchup. It's a really big deal. The second one is every second Saturday of every October, we play our in-state rival, Michigan State. It's always a grind. We're basically trying to kill each other. And then the holiest of all holy days, of any holy day that's ever existed, is every Thanksgiving weekend, Michigan plays Ohio State. Now, in the sports world, this game is literally termed the game. And most sports commentators say it's the greatest rivalry in all of sports. I know you guys are all Eagles fans and you have this thing with the Cowboys, but Michigan and Ohio State is a bigger deal. So we've been playing each other since before 1900, and we have kept track of every single game and every single score since before 1900. And Michigan currently leads the series 59-54. Now, when I watch these games, just imagine a Zach when, let's say we play Notre Dame. I'm on the edge of my seat. When we play Michigan State, I'm standing in the middle of the room 5 feet from the television. And when we play Ohio State, I'm literally on my knees begging to the football gods that we win this year. Now, the last 2 years, we have won. And I know people say the birth of your first child is the greatest experience you'll ever know. But us beating Ohio State is really darn close. It's really close. So as you saw in the pictures that were going up on the screen, and you can show them again, I am fully dubbed up in my vestments. I am wearing my religious apparel for my team, head to foot. And my poor wife, she did not know what she was getting into when she married me. She thought, oh, this is a nice man. Maybe he'll be a good dad, a good husband. She didn't realize that she wasn't just marrying into a family, but she was kind of marrying into a cult. And she had to learn the hard way that, no, you don't schedule things on Saturdays in the fall because Michigan football is playing. And it would be sacrilegious and it would be sinful if I didn't watch my team fully garbed head to foot live when they're playing because they might lose if I'm not watching. Now, I want to ask you, this is all somewhat in jest, but if you're a football fan, you can probably relate. Is any of this rational? No, none of it is. If God came down and looked at me, I would be a little bit ashamed. On a Saturday when we play Ohio State, I basically care about nothing in this world but the game that's on the television. It's not rational. There is something happening at an emotional level, something deep down that's been ingrained in me. I literally form my schedule and calendar in the fall around the fact that Michigan football plays at certain times on Saturdays. And I have forced my wife into following this as well. And I know it's not rational, and I'm going to keep doing it anyway. And My son is going to grow up this way, and it's just going to keep happening. It's emotional. I have an emotional attachment to Michigan football. You could say it's begun to give shape to my life. And if you got close to me, and people who know me well would say that a part of Zach's identity is the fact that he's a Michigan football fan. I didn't fully rationally choose to be so. It's just kind of happened. It's come about. And I have participated. But I'm a Michigan football fan. It's ingrained in me. Now, you may be thinking, okay, all of this has been kind of interesting and great, but what does this really have to do with Psalm 100, and what does this have to do with worship? I said I wanted to convince you of something, and I said, you're a worshiper whether you like it or not, and you can't not be a worshiper. And then I said, you're emotionally influenced, whether you like it or not. It's just a fact of life. You are being formed into the identity of the things that you love and want. If all of that is true or somewhat true, here's what I want to submit to you this morning. Worship is about formation. Worship is simply a way of life. It's the way you shape your life around the things that you love. I want us to read Psalm 100 one more time and see if we can see some of this at work in this psalm. So you can stay seated. I'll read it one more time and see again what you notice. Shout for joy to the Lord, all the earth. Worship the Lord with gladness. Come before him with joyful songs. Know that the Lord is God. It is he who made us, and we are his. We are his people, the sheep of his pasture. Enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. Give thanks to him and praise his name. For the Lord is good, and his love endures forever. His faithfulness continues through all generations. Now, what do you notice when you read and hear this psalm? I would bet that you notice the same thing I notice and what most of us will notice. We see that there are certain commands and actions that we are to perform. So we're supposed to shout. We're supposed to worship the Lord, to come before him. We're supposed to know the Lord. We're supposed to enter his gates, to enter his courts. In other words, to come into his presence, to come and gather at church. We're supposed to praise him. This is how we tend to view worship. We view worship in terms of we're shouting, we're singing, we're coming to church, and we're doing particular actions. And that is right, but it's half the story. We should be doing these things, but it's half of the equation. Notice it if I read it this way. We're to shout, how? For joy. We're to worship the Lord with what? Gladness. We're to come before him with joyful songs. We're to enter his gates with thanksgiving and come into his presence with praise. We're to give thanks to him and praise his name. Alongside every command, alongside every action that we're supposed to do when we worship, is listed a certain disposition of your heart, or a certain way of being in the world, or a certain type of person you're becoming. Have you ever tried to worship when you're in a bad place? Have you ever, let's say you've come to church and you're having a really bad time. You're in a horrible season of life, and the pastor or the worship leader gets up and they read a psalm like Psalm 100. And it sounds joyful and jubilant and happy, and you're hearing the fact that you're supposed to shout and you're supposed to sing and you're supposed to raise your hands and you're supposed to do all these things. How difficult is it to worship when you're in a bad place? It's extremely difficult to worship. Part of the problem is that when we only think of worship in terms of certain actions, we can fake them when we need to. When you're in a bad season, or even if you're in a good season, but you just don't want to today, it's easy to fake singing. It's easy to show up at church. It's easy to do these certain things that we're supposed to do, but you can kind of just do them and then leave. We can get through it. We can fake it if we need to. What you can't fake is the dispositions that are attached to these actions. It's really hard to sustain faking things like being a joyful person, being a thankful person, being a person who's full of peace, being a person who offers praise. And here again is the point I want to return to. We worship so that we can become a certain type of person. Worship is about formation, or another way to say it, worship is a way of life. When we sing so that certain ways of the heart are formed in us. How many of you are familiar with the fruit of the Spirit, or the idea of the fruit of the Spirit? In Galatians, a letter written by Paul, we have a short description of what Paul would say the shape of a Christian life looks like. Someone who is walking in the way of Jesus looks like this. He says, "But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control." Now, if you're like me and you grew up in church, you probably as a kid went to kids' church and you were in programs and you did lots of fun crafts, and a lot of times they had to do with the fruit of the Spirit. And it's been easy to grow up thinking that these are things you work on one at a time. And I had someone say to me last week that the fruit of the Spirit have to grow together. It's easy for us to think that, okay, this month, this week, I'm going to work on self-control. Or I really need to become a more joyful person. Or I really need to work on being more thankful. Or I really need to work on my patience. It's natural to think that way, and then we kind of begin to work on it in isolation. So we're just working on self-control, self-control, self-control. But what Paul is saying is that really you become more self-controlling when you are more joyful and patient, and you know how to do and live the fruit of the Spirit. This is why in Psalm 100, we see the call to shout and the call to worship and the call to come before God, like we are this morning, but to do so with a certain heart or a certain way of existing. We come in through the doors and we worship so that we can continue to become a certain type of person. Now, I've said that a few times this morning. We worship to become a certain type of person. Notice that that statement can be applied to anything. It's very generic. It could be applied to your favorite brand, your favorite influencer, your favorite sports teams, your favorite political party. Anything could form you into their likeness. The point for us this morning is that there is a particular person that we are meant to become like, and that's Jesus. Worship is simply living the way of Jesus. When we live in the way of Jesus, we live so that the fruit of the Spirit, or these dispositions of the heart we see in the psalm, begin to be formed in us, so that even in a season where worship feels hard, we're still growing, and we're still able to offer some form of joy and thanks and praise. I want to try to wrap this up for us and close with this. As I was preparing to talk about the idea of worship, and I was spending time thinking about what am I going to talk about, I kept bumping up against a certain idea that I was uncomfortable with, and I didn't want to share it, and I still don't like it because I think it gets to the heart of what I'm trying to say. And it's that worship is really an act of defiance. Or another way to say that is worship is really about allegiance. If you think about it, if you worship one thing, you're already saying no to something else. If you offer your love to one thing, it's really hard to actually offer your love fully to something else. It's an exclusive equation. The great lie or illusion of our time is that we can love and worship what we want, when we want, how we want, and we can almost exchange them day by day. But in reality, whatever you're worshiping means you're not worshiping something else. And when we worship, we're offering a sort of allegiance. I want to end by looking very quickly at something that Paul said in Acts. In this short story, you have Paul walking through Athens. He's walking through the city, and he's looking around, and he notices, wow, there are a lot of idols, there are a lot of altars, and everyone's worshiping. And this is what Acts says. It says, Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship, and this is what I'm going to proclaim to you." Now, I think most of us read that, especially when Paul says, "I see that you are very religious," and we see it as a negative. But I actually think he's somewhat complimenting them. He's walking through and he notices that they are worshiping and that there's altars and temples. And he says, wow, you guys are really worshiping. You're worshiping so much that you have an altar to a God that might not exist, but just in case he does, we're going to make one anyway. You're so religious. You're so worshipful. You're living like a human being. But the problem is your worship is misdirected. And that's what I think he's getting at when he says, you are ignorant of the very thing you worship. And this is what I'm going to proclaim to you. What he goes on to proclaim is what we now call the gospel. In the 4th century, a theologian named Augustine had this beautiful, short statement that still is very true today. He said, when we love God well, when we're following God the way we should be, our passions are rightly ordered. Notice what he doesn't say. He doesn't say, when you follow God well, or when you follow God right, you've gotten rid of your passions. You don't have passions. You don't have loves. You don't have desires. He says, when you're following God well, the passions you have because you're a creature of God, because you're a human being, are now being ordered in the right way. When we're living the way of Jesus, when we're following in his footsteps, and we're being formed into his identity, all of those passions and desires and loves and wants and needs and lacks and hurts and pains and every emotion you could possibly feel begin to be formed so that they are good for you. This is what Augustine was getting at. Your passions, the fact that you are passionate isn't bad. The problem is that our passions can be misdirected and we can worship things that form us in such a way that's to our detriment. When Paul was walking through Athens and he saw the people, and it almost seems like he had compassion on them, and he said, wow, you guys, you're really trying. You're really worshiping. Look at all the altars you've made. But you're worshiping in such a way that you're missing the true reason of why you desire to worship. We desire to worship, as Paul would say, because we are desiring God, and we've just forgotten it. We've forgotten what that way of life looks like. I said that worship is about being formed into a certain type of person, and that person is Jesus. I don't want you to walk away thinking, oh, great, here's another set of lists and commands and things I need to go learn and a long list of emotions I need to master, and that's not what I'm saying. I would say, actually, if you're curious, if you're thinking, okay, what would it be like to live the way of Jesus? I would say simply start by reading the Gospels. But focus a little less on the teachings of Jesus, which is what we like to focus on. What did he teach and what ideas came from them and what doctrines then come from that? Those are important. But focus on this way of his life. Where did he go? How did he move? Who did he talk to? How did he treat people? What did the shape of his life look like? There's a lot in here about what it looked like for Jesus to live a human life and how we can learn from him and follow him. But remember, and this is the hard part, that if you begin to follow Jesus, if you follow his way, if worship tends to look like following Jesus, you are picking Jesus. You're saying no to something else, and you have to. Worship is about offering ourselves to the altar that we pick. So which altar do you have today? I've had many throughout my life. But I would ask you to consider trying to live the life of Jesus.